Hello, and welcome. It's good to have you here, wherever you are right now. Perhaps you're settling into bed, or resting in a quiet corner of your day, or simply pausing to let the world slow down around you. However you've arrived, you're welcome. There's no need to do anything but listen and breathe and let yourself be still. You may be tired. That's all right. In fact, it's more than all right. This is a place designed for tiredness. A gentle space where you can simply be without effort or expectation. You don't need to remember everything you hear tonight. You don't need to take notes or stay alert or prove anything at all. If your mind drifts, let it drift. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. If sleep finds you before the end, that's exactly as it should be. Tonight, we're going to talk about something quietly beautiful. Something that has rested on cave walls and temple ceilings, on wooden panels and stretched canvas for thousands upon thousands of years. We're going to explore the pigments used in ancient paintings, the colored powders and paste that human hands once ground, mixed, and brushed onto surfaces to capture light, shadow, story, and spirit. And we're going to do this slowly, softly, with all the time in the world. Before we begin in earnest, if you enjoy this kind of thing, these slow journeys through science and history, you're welcome to follow along for more. But there's no pressure. You're here now, and that's enough. So let us begin quietly at the very start. Long, long ago, before cities rose and before writing captured thought, humans looked at the earth beneath their feet and saw color. They saw the red of iron-rich clay, the yellow of certain stones, the black of charred wood and manganese dust. They saw white in chalk and limestone, and in these simple materials, they found a way to speak without words. The first pigments were not invented. They were discovered, gathered, and transformed by hands that understood patience. Ochre is perhaps the oldest pigment we know. It is a word that sounds warm, rounded, like the earth itself. Ochre comes from iron oxide, a compound that forms when iron meets oxygen and time. In its various forms, ochre can be yellow, red, orange, or brown, depending on how much water the iron oxide contains and how it has been heated or weathered. Yellow ochre holds water molecules within its structure. Red ochre, which we call hematite when it's in its mineral form, has been heated or naturally dehydrated, and so it glows with a deeper, warmer hue. People have used ochre for at least 300,000 years. Think of that span of time, if you can. It stretches back far beyond recorded history, beyond agriculture, beyond the last ice age. Ochre was there, cradled in human hands, long before we were quite the people we are now. It was rubbed onto skin, pressed into cave walls, mixed with fat and spit and water to make it flow. In the Blombos cave in South Africa, archaeologists found ochre that had been ground and stored in abalone shells, mixed with bone marrow and charcoal, perhaps to make a kind of paint. This mixture is roughly 100,000 years old. Imagine the hands that held those shells. Imagine the quiet, careful work of grinding stone against stone, the slow accumulation of powder, the decision to mix, to store, to save this color for later. There is something deeply soothing in knowing that the impulse to create and preserve beauty is so very old. Ochre doesn't fade. It is stable, enduring, chemically content to remain itself across millennia. This is one of the reasons it has survived in caves and on artifacts, why we can still see the handprints and the animals and the abstract patterns painted so long ago. The iron in ochre is already oxidized. It has already made its peace with the air. It does not rust further. It does not decay. It simply rests, holding its color, waiting to be seen. And so, in the Lascaux caves in France, in Altamira in Spain, on rock walls across Australia and Africa, and the Americas, ochre glows softly in the beam of a flashlight or the flicker of a lamp, just as it did when it was first applied. The reds and yellows are gentle, earthy, warm. They do not shout. They hum quietly across the ages. Charcoal, too, is ancient. It is carbon, pure and simple, made by burning wood or bone in a low-oxygen environment. The process is called pyrolysis. The wood does not burst into flame and vanish into ash. Instead, it smolders slowly, and what remains is a black, brittle substance that crumbles easily into powder. This powder, when mixed with a binder, becomes a pigment. It is the black of countless ancient images. Charcoal is soft. It makes a mark that is matte, deep, and absorbent of light. It does not gleam or shimmer. It holds darkness tenderly. In the hands of a Paleolithic painter, it could outline the curve of a bison's back or fill in the shadow beneath a horse's belly. It is a pigment of shape and depth, of quiet contrast against the lighter stone. Manganese dioxide provided another black, one that is slightly different in tone. Manganese is a metal, and its oxide is a mineral found in certain rocks. When ground, it produces a black that is a little cooler, a little less warm than charcoal. Some ancient painters preferred one, some the other, and some used both, perhaps without knowing the chemical difference, guided only by the subtle shift and feeling that each black conveyed. White pigments came from chalk and lime. Chalk is calcium carbonate, formed from the shells of ancient marine organisms that lived millions of years ago, settled on the seafloor, and were compressed into soft, pale stone. Lime, or calcium hydroxide, can be made by heating limestone and then slaking it with water. Both are gentle whites, not brilliant, not harsh. They are the white of bone and cloud, of eggshell and frost. These early pigments, ochre, charcoal, manganese, chalk, were all that was needed for a long, long time. They were enough to tell stories, to mark territory, to honor the dead, to celebrate the animals that share the world. They were enough because they came from the world itself, and they carried the world's quiet palette. As human societies grew more complex, so did the search for color. People began to notice that certain rocks, when ground, gave colors that Earth alone did not provide. They found blue in azurite, a copper carbonate mineral that forms in the oxidized zones of copper or deposits. Azurite is a soft, striking blue, the blue of deep water or a clear winter sky. It was used in ancient Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in China. It was precious, but not impossibly rare, and it brought a new coolness into the palette. Malachite, another copper mineral, provided green. It often forms alongside azurite, and the two are chemically related. Malachite is a rich, warm green, the green of spring leaves or moss on whetstone. It was ground into powder and used in tomb paintings, on pottery, in cosmetics. Both azurite and malachite are soft minerals, easy to grind by hand, and their colors are vivid even when the particles are coarse. But copper minerals are not perfectly stable. Over time, azurite can transform into malachite. The blue can shift to green. This happens slowly, molecule by molecule, as the mineral structure changes in response to moisture or air. In some ancient paintings, what was once a blue sky is now tinged with green, a quiet reminder that even stone is subject to change. Cinnabar gave the ancient world its brightest red. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide, a mineral that forms near volcanic vents and hot springs. It is dense and heavy, and when ground, it produces a red so vivid it almost seems to glow. The Chinese called it vermilion when prepared as a pigment, and it was used in everything from palace decorations to the seals of emperors. The Romans used it lavishly, despite, or perhaps because of, its expense. Cinnabar was mined in a place called Almaden in Spain, a site that has been worked for over 2,000 years. The miners knew the work was dangerous. Mercury is toxic, and cinnabar, though stable in its mineral form, releases mercury vapor when heated. The dust could be inhaled, the metal could seep into skin, and yet the color was so desired that the mining continued. and the pigment traveled across empires. There is something sobering in this, but also something tender. The desire for beauty, for color, for the ability to make a mark that would last, was so strong that people were willing to endure hardship to obtain it. It speaks to a deep human need, one that is not frivolous but fundamental. We need color. We need to see the world reflected and transformed. We need to make things that outlast us. Egyptian blue is one of the first synthetic pigments ever made. It was not found in nature. It was created intentionally by human hands and human ingenuity around 5,000 years ago. The Egyptians took sand, which is mostly silica, and mixed it with a copper compound, usually malachite or azurite, and calcium carbonate from limestone, and a small amount of natron, a naturally occurring salt. They heated this mixture to a high temperature, around 850 to 1,000 degrees Celsius, and held it there for hours. What emerged from the kiln was a new substance, a crystalline material with a structure that had never existed before. When ground, it produced a blue unlike any natural mineral, a blue that was bright and clear and stable, a blue that did not fade in sunlight or change over time. This blue was used on temple walls, on statues, on jewelry and pottery. It was the blue of the heavens, the blue of the Nile, the blue of divinity. The process of making Egyptian blue required knowledge, patience, and control. The temperature had to be just right. Too cool, and the ingredients would not fuse. Too hot, and the mixture would melt into glass. The proportions had to be balanced. The kiln had to be tended. It was a kind of alchemy, though the Egyptians did not call it that. They simply knew that if they did certain things in a certain order, beauty would result. And the blue they made has lasted. Entombed sealed for millennia, Egyptian blue still glows softly on the walls, as fresh as the day it was painted. Archaeologists and conservators marvel at its stability. Chemists study its structure and find it remarkably resistant to decay. It is a pigment that embodies patience, both in its making and in its endurance. Han blue and Han purple are the Chinese equivalents, though they are not quite the same chemically. They were made using similar principles, heating silica, copper, and barium compounds, and they appear in the paint on terracotta warriors and in tomb decorations. Like Egyptian blue, they are synthetic, stable, and beautiful. They represent another culture's quiet mastery of fire and stone. Lead white is one of the most important pigments in the history of painting, and also one of the most dangerous. It is basic lead carbonate, made by exposing metallic lead to acetic acid vapors and carbon dioxide. The process, called the stack process or the Dutch process, was slow and labor-intensive. Lead sheets were coiled and placed in pots with vinegar. The pots were stacked and buried in dung or bark, which generated heat and carbon dioxide as it decomposed. Over weeks or months, the lead corroded into a white crust, which was then scraped off, washed, ground, and dried. The resulting pigment is a dense, opaque, luminous white. It has a slight warmth to it, a creaminess that pure chalk or gypsum lacks. It mixes beautifully with oils, creating smooth, flexible paint films. It was used by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and later by Renaissance and Baroque painters, who built up their luminous flesh tones and glowing highlights with layer upon patient layer of lead white. But lead is a neurotoxin. It accumulates in the body. It damages the nervous system, the kidneys, the blood. The people who made lead white, often women and children, working in poorly ventilated spaces, suffered. Painters who licked their brushes to keep a fine point, or who breathed the dust while grinding pigments, suffered. The beauty came at a cost. Yet for centuries, there was no substitute that worked as well. Lead white was unmatched in its covering power, its handling, its ability to catch and reflect light. So it continued to be used, carefully by some, carelessly by others, until modern chemistry finally offered safer alternatives. Vermilion, as we mentioned, came from Cinnabar. But vermilion could also be made synthetically by combining mercury and sulfur and heating them together. The process was known in China as early as the 4th century BCE and later in the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Synthetic vermilion was chemically identical to natural cinnabar, but it could be made in larger quantities and with more consistent quality. The color is extraordinary. It is a red that is both warm and intense, a red that seems to vibrate on the surface. It was used for illuminated manuscripts, for the robes of saints, for seals and signatures. In traditional Chinese painting, vermilion was the red of joy, celebration, and life force. It was applied with reverence. But vermilion, like cinnabar, contains mercury, and over time, in certain conditions, especially in the presence of light and chloride ions, vermilion can darken. It could turn black. This transformation, called metacinnabar formation, is a slow chemical change. Some paintings that once glowed with red now bear dark, ashen patches. It is a reminder that even the most stable pigments are not eternal. They are part of the world, subject to its laws. Orpiment and realgar are two arsenic sulfide minerals that provided yellow and orange. Orpiment is a bright, golden yellow, the yellow of sunlight on wheat. Realgar is a fiery orange-red. Both were used in ancient and medieval painting, especially in Asia and the Middle East. Both are also highly toxic. Arsenic is a poison, well known even in antiquity. Yet orpiment and realgar were valued for their brilliance, their intensity, their ability to convey warmth and light. They were used sparingly, carefully, with an understanding that beauty and danger could coexist in the same substance. Over time, realgar is unstable. When exposed to light, it can break down into a yellow powder called pararealgar, and eventually into a white or colorless form. Paintings that once had vivid orange details may now appear faded or altered. Conservators must work gently with these pigments, understanding their chemistry, their fragility, their slow surrender to time. Ultramarine is perhaps the most famous and most precious pigment of the ancient and medieval world. It came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone found primarily in the mountains of Afghanistan, in a region called Badakhshan. Lapis lazuli is a complex rock, a mixture of several minerals, but its intense blue color comes from lazurite, a sulfur-containing mineral. To make ultramarine pigment, lapis lazuli had to be crushed and then purified, because the raw stone also contained white calcite and glittering pyrite, which would dull the blue. The purification process was painstaking. The crushed stone was mixed with wax, resin, and oils into a dough, which was then kneaded underwater. The blue particles, being lighter, would float into the water, while the impurities remained in the dough. This process was repeated many times, and the first extractions yielded the finest, most vivid blue. Later extractions were paler. Ultramarine was more expensive than gold. It had to be transported across mountains and deserts, through empires and trade routes that spanned continents. It arrived in Europe as a rare and precious commodity, used only for the most important subjects, usually the robes of the Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven, who deserved the most beautiful blue on earth. The color is unlike any other. It is deep, luminous, slightly warm despite being blue. It does not fade. It does not change. It is chemically stable, indifferent to light and air and time. A painting made with ultramarine 600 years ago still glows with the same blue today. There is something deeply comforting in this. In a world where so much is impermanent, where colors fade and materials decay, ultramarine remains. It is a blue you can trust. Indigo is not a mineral. It is organic, made from plants. The indigo plant, Indigofera tinctoria, and several related species contain a precursor molecule called indican. When the leaves are harvested, soaked in water, and allowed to ferment, enzymes break down the indican into indoxyl. When this liquid is exposed to air and beaten or stirred, the indoxyl oxidizes and becomes indigo tin, the blue dye we know as indigo. Indigo was used as a dye for textiles for thousands of years in India, in Africa, in Central and South America, in East Asia. But it could also be precipitated out of the dye bath, dried, and formed into cakes or balls, which could then be used as a pigment. This form of indigo was traded along the same routes as spices and silk. The blue of indigo is different from ultramarine. It is cooler, darker, more subdued. It is the blue of deep twilight, of shadowed water. It was less costly than ultramarine, but still valuable. It was used in manuscripts, in wall paintings, in decorative arts. Indigo is organic, and organic materials are generally less stable than minerals. They can fade in light, break down in air, be eaten by microbes. Yet indigo, once it is bonded to a surface or fiber, is surprisingly durable. The chemistry of its double bond structure makes it resistant to degradation. Ancient textiles dyed with indigo can still show strong color after centuries. Madder is another organic pigment, derived from the root of the madder plant, Rubia tinctorum. The root contains several molecules called anthraquinones, the most important of which is alizarin. When the root is dried, ground, and extracted with water or a weak alkali, the dye can be used to color fabric or, when combined with a mordant, to make a pigment called madder lake. A lake pigment is made by binding a dye to an inert substrate, often a metal salt like alum, aluminum sulfate. The dye molecules attach to the aluminum ions, forming an insoluble colored compound that can be ground into a pigment. Madder lake produces reds and pinks, from soft rose to deep crimson, depending on the preparation and the mordant used. Madder was grown and used across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East for millennia. It was the red of soldiers' coats, of tapestries, of illuminated borders. As a pigment, it was prized for its transparency and its range. Painters could glaze it over other colors to create warmth and depth. But madder, like all organic pigments, is vulnerable. It can fade in strong light. It can shift in hue if the surrounding chemistry changes. Conservators must be gentle with it, aware that what looks strong may be fragile. Weld, or Dyer's rocket, is a plant that provided yellow. It contains a flavonoid called luteolin. Like madder, weld could be made into a lake pigment. The yellows it produced were bright and clear, useful for greens when mixed with blue, or for golden tones when used alone. Saffron, the dried stigmas of the crocus flower, also gave yellow, though it was so expensive that its use as a pigment was rare. It was more often a dye, a spice, a symbol of wealth. But in some manuscripts, in some precious illuminations, saffron's warm, glowing yellow can still be found. Kermes and cochineal are two insects that provided red dyes and lake pigments. Kermes comes from a scale insect that lives on oak trees in the Mediterranean. Cochineal comes from a different scale insect that lives on cactus in Central and South America. Both insects produce carminic acid, a molecule that, when extracted and processed, yields a brilliant red. These reds are organic, but they are also remarkably stable for organic pigments. They were used in manuscripts, in panel paintings, in textiles worn by kings. The discovery of cochineal in the Americas and its introduction to Europe in the 16th century revolutionized the availability of intense red, though by then we are moving beyond the ancient world. Verdigris is a green pigment made from copper. It forms naturally when copper corrodes in the presence of acetic acid, vinegar. Sheets of copper were hung over vats of fermenting wine or vinegar, and the blue-green crust that formed was scraped off and ground. The result is a bright, transparent green, more vivid than malachite. Verdigris was widely used in medieval and Renaissance painting. It was valued for its intensity and its clarity, but is not stable. Over time, especially in the presence of moisture or certain binders, verdigris can darken or turn brown. It can also react with other pigments, causing unexpected changes. Painters learn to use it carefully, sometimes isolating it in separate layers. Despite its instability, verdigris was loved. It was the green of leaves and grass, of spring and growth. It was worth the risk. Bone black, also called ivory black, is made by charring bones in a closed container. The bones burn without flame, and what remains is a black powder that contains not only carbon, but also calcium phosphate. This gives bone black a slight warmth and a unique handling quality. It was used by painters for centuries, prized for its deep, soft black and its smooth texture. The process of making bone black is simple, but it requires patience. The bones must be heated slowly, evenly, for hours. The result is a pigment that is both humble and beautiful, made from what was once alive, now transformed into color. Lamp black is made from soot. It is the black that collects on a surface held over an oil lamp or a smoky flame. It is almost pure carbon, very fine, very light. It was collected, processed, and used as a pigment and as ink. The ink used in ancient Chinese and Japanese calligraphy and painting is often lamp black, bound with glue made from animal skin or fish. Lamp black is soft and deep. It does not have the slight brownness of charcoal or the warmth of bone black. It is a cool, neutral black, the black of night, of absence of the space between stars. Gypsum, or calcium sulfate, provided another white. It was softer and less opaque than lead white, but it was safe, abundant, and easy to prepare. It was used as a ground, a preparatory layer on panels and walls, and sometimes mixed into paints to extend more expensive pigments or to modify their texture. Kaolin, a white clay, was also used, especially in Asia. It is the same clay used to make porcelain. When finely ground, it can serve as a white pigment or as a filler. It is soft, absorbent, and chemically inert. These humble materials, gypsum, kaolin, chalk, do not have the drama of ultramarine or the danger of lead white, but they are the quiet foundation of countless paintings. They are the ground on which color rests. Red lead, or minium, is lead tetroxide, made by heating lead white or metallic lead in air. The result is a bright orange red, vivid and opaque. It was used in manuscripts, in illuminations, in decorative painting. The word miniature may come from minium because it was used to paint the small, detailed illustrations in medieval books. Red lead is toxic, like all lead compounds. It is also reactive. In the presence of sulfur-containing pigments or pollutants, it can darken. In some old manuscripts, the bright red initials have turned brown or black. Conservators must understand these reactions to interpret what they see and to prevent further change. Smalt is a blue pigment made by grinding blue glass. The glass is colored with cobalt, a metal that produces a strong, clear blue. Smalt was used from the Renaissance onward, but the technology of cobalt-colored glass is older, reaching back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Smalt is not as stable as mineral blues. The glass particles can lose their color over time, especially if the glass is poorly made or if it is exposed to moisture. The blue can fade to gray, but when fresh, smalt is beautiful, a cool, slightly grayish blue, different from azurite or ultramarine. Terra verte, or green earth, is a natural clay pigment containing iron and magnesium silicates. It is a soft, muted green, the green of lichen or weathered bronze. It was used by medieval and Renaissance painters for underpainting flesh tones because its cool green provided a subtle contrast that made the warm pinks and ochres of skin appear more luminous. Terra verte is gentle. It is not a green that demands attention. It is a green that supports, that underlies, that quietly does its work beneath the surface. Umber and sienna are earth pigments like ochre, but they contain manganese as well as iron. Raw umber is a greenish-brown. Burnt umber, heated to drive off water and change the iron oxide, is a rich, warm brown. Raw sienna is a yellowish-brown. Burnt sienna is a deep, reddish-brown. These pigments are earthy, warm, endlessly useful. They are the browns of wood and soil, of shadow and depth. They do not fade. They do not change. They are as reliable as the ground itself. And so, slowly, gently, we have begun to see the palette of the ancient world. We have touched on minerals and metals, plants and insects, fire and time. We have seen that color is not simply decoration. It is chemistry, geology, biology, culture, and need, all woven together. Each pigment has a story. Each one was found, or made, or traded by people who wanted to capture something: light, spirit, memory, beauty. And each one has endured in some form, carrying those stories forward into the present. The making of pigments required patience, grinding stone against stone, hour after hour, to produce a fine powder, heating materials in kilns, tending the fire, waiting for the transformation, extracting dye from plants, fermenting, stirring, precipitating, drying. These were slow processes, rhythmic, meditative. There was no hurry. There was only the work and the gradual emergence of color. In a way, learning about these pigments is a slow process too. Each fact is a small stone, smooth and cool, to be turned over in the mind. There is no need to rush. There is no test at the end. There is only the quiet pleasure of knowing, of understanding a little more about how the world works and how humans have moved through it. And so we will continue, gently, into the next part of our journey. But for now, let yourself rest in what you've heard. Let the colors settle softly in your mind. Ochre and ultramarine, charcoal and vermilion, the blues and greens and earth reds that have traveled across time to reach us. You're doing well. You are here, and you are listening, and that is enough. And as we continue softly through this quiet gallery of ancient color, let us turn our attention to the way these pigments were prepared, because the making of paint was itself a meditation, a slow ritual that connected the artist to the earth and to time. The grinding of minerals was not rushed. It happened in stone mortars, sometimes for hours, the pestle moving in circles, back and forth, wearing down crystals into powder so fine it could float on breath. This grinding was essential. The finer the particle, the smoother the paint, the more evenly it would lie upon the wall or panel. And so the painter ground and rested and ground again, finding a rhythm that was almost like breathing. The grinding also changed the way light moved through the pigment. When particles are large, they scatter light in chaotic ways, and the color looks dull, grainy, rough. But when ground to the right fineness, each tiny fragment catches and releases light in harmony with its neighbors, and the color glows. This is why the same mineral, coarsely ground or finely ground, can look like two different substances. The labor of grinding was not separate from the art. It was part of the art, a kind of invisible brushstroke that shaped the final image before the image even began. Once ground, the pigment needed a binder, something to hold the particles together and fix them to the surface. In ancient times, many binders were used, each one chosen for its own quiet properties. Egg yolk was a favorite, especially in tempera painting. The yolk, whisked gently and mixed with the powdered pigment, created a paint that dried quickly, bonded tightly, and lasted for centuries. Egg tempera does not fade easily. It does not crack in the same way oil paint can. It sits calmly on the surface, stable and patient, holding its color through the long passage of time. Gum arabic, drawn from the sap of acacia trees, was another binder, used often in manuscript illumination and watercolor. It dissolves in water, becomes sticky and transparent, and when mixed with pigment, it allows the color to flow smoothly from a brush. Gum arabic dries to a slight sheen, not glossy, not matte, but somewhere in between, a gentle surface that invites the eye without dazzling it. The paint made with gum arabic can be re-wetted, reworked, layered again and again, which made it ideal for the delicate, intricate work of illuminating texts. In fresco painting, the binder was not added by the artist at all. It was created by the wall itself. Wet plaster, freshly applied, is alkaline and slightly caustic. When pigment is brushed onto this wet surface, the particles sink into the plaster, and as the plaster dries, it undergoes a chemical transformation called carbonation. The calcium hydroxide in the plaster reacts with carbon dioxide in the air and becomes calcium carbonate, essentially limestone. The pigment becomes locked inside this new stone layer, held not by glue or oil, but by the crystalline structure of the wall itself. This is why frescoes, when they survive, are so permanent. The color is not on the wall, it is in the wall. But fresco had its limitations. The artist had to work quickly while the plaster was still wet, usually within a few hours. Each day, only a small section of plaster could be applied, enough to be painted before it dried. This section was called a giornata, from the Italian word for day. If you look closely at old frescoes, you can sometimes see the faint seams between one day's work and the next, a quiet record of time passing, of the artist's patient progress across the wall. Not all pigments could be used in fresco. The alkaline plaster would react with some colors, changing them, dulling them, or destroying them entirely. Azurite, for instance, could not survive the caustic environment of wet plaster. It would turn greenish or gray. So for blues in fresco, the artist often had to use pigments that were alkali stable or apply the blue later, after the plaster had dried, using a different binder. This technique was called fresco secco, painting on dry plaster, and it was less permanent, more vulnerable to flaking and fading, but sometimes necessary to achieve certain colors. The choice of binder also affected the way the pigment looked. The same ochre, mixed with egg, with gum, or with oil, would appear slightly different each time. Egg tempera gives a matte, chalky finish. Oil gives depth and richness, a kind of inner glow. Gum arabic gives translucency, a lightness. And so the binder was not just a practical necessity. It was an aesthetic choice, a way of shaping the character of the color, of guiding the way light would meet the surface and return to the viewer's eye. Let us drift now toward the pigment known as orpiment, a mineral of arsenic and sulfur, bright as sunlight, yellow as a field of wild mustard in spring. Orpiment was used across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, prized for its intensity, its almost unnatural brilliance. It is a soft mineral, easily ground, and it produces a yellow that does not fade, but is also toxic. Arsenic sulfide, when handled carelessly, can poison the skin, the lungs, the blood. And yet painters used it carefully, knowingly, because no other yellow was quite so luminous. In Persian and Mughal manuscripts, orpiment was often used to depict golden light, the glow of divinity, the radiance of kings. It was layered, sometimes, over gold leaf, or mixed with other yellows to modulate its intensity. The artists who worked with orpiment knew its dangers, and they took precautions, grinding it in ventilated spaces, washing their hands, avoiding breathing the dust. The knowledge of toxicity was passed down quietly from master to apprentice, a kind of whispered safety manual embedded in the tradition. Orpiment also had a strange chemical personality. It did not mix well with lead-based pigments. When orpiment and lead white were placed side by side, or layered, they could react over time, darkening, discoloring, creating halos of chemical change. And so the painter had to think not only about color, but about compatibility, about which pigments could live peacefully together on the same surface, and which would, over decades or centuries, begin to argue. Another yellow, gentler and more common, was yellow ochre, which we have met before, but which deserves another moment of attention. Yellow ochre is iron oxide mixed with clay, the same family as red ochre, but with iron in a different oxidation state. It is the color of dry grass, of sand, of late afternoon light. It was used everywhere, in every culture, because it was abundant, stable, and kind. It did not react with other pigments. It did not fade. It could be mixed with white to make pale creams, or with reds to make warm tans and browns. It was the quiet workhorse of the palette, never showy, always reliable. There was also a yellow made from a mineral called malachite, which is lead monoxide. Malachite was produced by heating lead white, transforming it into a soft, golden yellow. It was used in European painting, especially in the underpainting of flesh tones, where its warmth would glow through subsequent layers. But like all lead compounds, it was toxic, and it could darken over time if exposed to sulfur compounds in the air. Still, it was valued for its opacity, its covering power, the way it could hide what lay beneath and create a new ground for other colors to rest upon. In India, a yellow pigment was made from the urine of cows fed only on mango leaves. This pigment was called Indian yellow, or peri, and it was a deep, golden, slightly greenish yellow, rich and translucent. The process was strange and specific. The cows, fed this restricted diet, would produce urine high in a compound called xanthic acid. The urine was collected, heated, and the yellow substance would precipitate out, then be formed into balls and dried. The practice was eventually banned in the early 20th century because it was harmful to the cows. But for centuries, this peculiar pigment traveled from India to Europe, where artists prized it for glazing, for creating luminous shadows, for the warmth it brought to skies and fabrics. Let us move now into the greens, those colors of leaves and moss, of copper and growth. Malachite, as we have touched upon, was one of the oldest greens, a copper carbonate mineral, bright and opaque. But there were other greens, too, each with its own story. Verdigris, for instance, was made by exposing copper to acetic acid, essentially vinegar. Copper plates were stacked with fermenting grape skins or soaked cloths, and over time, a green crust would form on the metal. This crust was scraped off, ground, and used as pigment. Verdigris is a blue-green, sharp and vivid, and it was widely used in medieval manuscripts and panel paintings. But verdigris is not stable. It is acidic, and over time it can corrode the surface it is painted on, eating through parchment, darkening, turning brown or black. Many medieval greens have changed color over the centuries because of verdigris. What was once a lush green forest in a manuscript might now appear as a dark, muddy brown. This is not the fault of the artist. It is simply the nature of the material, the slow chemistry of decay. And yet, knowing this, artists continued to use verdigris because in its fresh state, it was beautiful, and beauty, even temporary, was worth pursuing. Another green, more stable, was green earth, a natural clay pigment containing iron and magnesium silicates. Green earth is soft, muted, the color of wet stone or shadowed foliage. It was used often in the underpainting of skin tones, especially in Italian Renaissance painting. The artist would first model the face in green earth, establishing the shadows and volumes, and then layer warm, flesh-colored glazes over it. The green would show through faintly in the shadows, giving the skin a subtle, lifelike coolness, a hint of the blood and depth beneath the surface. This technique, called verdacho, relied on the transparency of the upper layers and the quiet, recessive nature of the green earth below. There was also a green made by mixing blue and yellow, a simple solution that gave the painter more control over the exact hue. Azurite and yellow ochre, or ultramarine and orpiment, could be combined to create a wide range of greens. This was practical, economical, and allowed for subtle variation. But mixed greens do not always have the same vibrancy as mineral greens. They can look duller, less saturated, because the particles of two different pigments scatter light in more complex ways. Still, in many paintings, mixed greens were the norm, especially where mineral greens were unavailable or too expensive. Now let us consider the blacks, those colors of night, of shadow, of the spaces between. Charcoal, as we have seen, was the most ancient black, made from burned wood. But there were other blacks, too, each with a different character. Lamp black was made from the soot of burning oil or resin. A flame was held beneath a cool surface, and the soot would collect, fine and soft as velvet. This soot was gathered, processed, and used as pigment. Lamp black is a warm black, slightly brownish, and it was used in inks and washes in the deepest shadows of paintings. Bone black, also called ivory black, was made by charring animal bones in a closed container without oxygen. The bones would turn black, and when ground, they produced a pigment that was not pure carbon, but a mixture of carbon and calcium phosphate. This gave bone black a slight grayish or bluish tint, cooler than lamp black, and also a bit of body, a slight texture. Bone black was prized for its neutrality, its ability to darken other colors without shifting their hue too much. It was a black that could disappear into other colors, a shadow that did not assert itself. There was also a black made from burned grapevines or peach pits, sometimes called vine black. Each source of carbon gave a slightly different black, and painters learned to distinguish them, to choose the one that best suited their purpose. A warm black for earth tones, a cool black for skies, a dense black for calligraphy, a transparent black for washes. The variety was subtle, but real, and it mattered. Whites, too, came in different forms. Lead white, as we have discussed, was the most important white in European painting for many centuries. But there was also chalk or calcium carbonate, which was used in grounds, in gesso, and sometimes mixed into paints to extend them, to make them go further. Chalk white is less opaque than lead white, less brilliant, but it is safe, stable, and abundant. It was used in fresco, where lead white could not be used, and in many preparatory layers. In some Asian painting traditions, a white was made from powdered shells, especially oyster shells, which are also calcium carbonate. Shell white was ground very finely and used in delicate work, in the highlights of silk paintings, in the petals of flowers and the eyes of figures. It has a soft, slightly warm tone, and it blends gently with other pigments, never harsh, never stark. There was also a white made from zinc oxide, though this came into use later, in the 18th century. Zinc white is cooler than lead white, less opaque, but also less toxic and more stable in certain conditions. It does not darken when exposed to sulfur, and it does not react with other pigments in the same way lead does. But it is more brittle, more prone to cracking, and so it was used carefully, often in mixtures or in specific techniques. Let us turn now to the purples, those rare and precious colors that have always carried a sense of mystery and power. True purple pigments were scarce in the ancient world. There was no abundant purple mineral, no easy purple earth. And so purple had to be made, either by mixing red and blue, or by extracting it from living creatures. The most famous purple of antiquity was Tyrian purple, a dye made from the glands of sea snails, specifically murex snails, harvested from the Mediterranean. Thousands of snails were needed to produce even a small amount of dye. The process was laborious, smelly, and expensive, and the resulting color was a deep, rich purple with a hint of red, the color of royalty, of emperors and kings. Tyrian purple was used primarily for dyeing fabric, but it could also be used as a pigment, though rarely, because of its cost. In painting, purple was more often achieved by layering or mixing. A glaze of red matter over ultramarine blue could create a luminous purple, or red, ochre, and azurite could be mixed to produce a more muted, earthy purple. These mixed purples did not have the intensity of Tyrian purple, but they were beautiful in their own way, softer, more painterly, more suited to the gentle transitions of shadow and light. There was also a pigment called hematite, which in its natural form is a deep red, but which, when ground very finely and mixed with certain binders, can take on a purplish tone. Hematite was used in prehistoric cave paintings, and it continued to be used for thousands of years, a link between the earliest humans and the painters of the classical world. Now let us think about the way these pigments were stored and kept. In ancient workshops, pigments were precious. They were kept in small containers, often ceramic jars or wooden boxes, sealed to protect them from moisture and light. Each pigment had its own container, labeled or known by memory. The painter would take only what was needed for the day's work, mixing small amounts, never wasting. Waste was not just impractical. It was a kind of disrespect to the material, to the labor that had brought it into being. Some pigments were more stable than others in storage. Ochres and earth colors could sit for years without changing. But organic pigments, like the lakes made from plants and insects, could fade even in the jar, especially if exposed to light. And so they were kept in the dark, in cool places, wrapped in cloth or leather. The knowledge of how to store pigments was part of the craft, passed down quietly, learned through experience and mistake. The mixing of pigments was also a careful art. Some colors could be blended freely, but others could not. Mixing lead white with orpiment, as we have noted, could cause problems. Mixing verdigris with lead white could lead to discoloration. The painter had to know not only color theory, but chemistry, or at least the practical chemistry of compatibility. This knowledge was often recorded in workshop manuals, recipe books that listed which pigments worked well together and which did not. These manuals were treasured, copied, handed down, a kind of oral and written tradition that preserved centuries of experimentation. Let us consider now the pigment called realgar, a close relative of orpiment. Realgar is also an arsenic sulfide, but with a different structure, and it produces a brilliant orange red, the color of fire, of autumn leaves, of warning. It was used in Asian painting, especially in Chinese and Persian manuscripts, where its intensity was unmatched. But realgar is even more toxic than orpiment, and it is also unstable. Over time, especially when exposed to light, realgar can degrade into a yellow powder, a process called photooxidation. Paintings that once had vivid orange details may now appear yellow or pale, the realgar having transformed chemically, molecule by molecule, into something else. This instability was not always understood by the artists who used it. They saw the brilliance, the beauty, and they used it, trusting that the color would last. But time is a chemist, patient and relentless, and it changes things in ways we cannot always predict. And so we must look at ancient paintings with a kind of double vision, seeing both what is there now and imagining what was there once, the lost brilliance, the faded fire. Another orange pigment, more stable, was red lead, also called minium. Red lead is lead tetroxide, made by heating lead white or metallic lead in air. It is a bright, warm orange, opaque and strong, and it was used widely in manuscripts, in illuminated initials, in the robes of saints and the borders of pages. The word miniature may even derive from minium, because small, detailed paintings and manuscripts were often dominated by this vivid orange red. Red lead is more stable than realgar, but it is still a lead compound, still toxic, and and it can darken over time if exposed to pollutants or certain environmental conditions. Let us drift now toward the browns, those colors of earth and wood, of shadow and age. Many browns were simply mixtures, combinations of red and black, or yellow and black, or red and green. But there are also natural brown pigments. Raw umber is a clay containing iron and manganese oxides, and it produces a cool, greenish brown, the color of wet soil. Burnt umber is the same clay, heated, which drives off water and changes the iron oxide, resulting in a warmer, reddish brown. These pigments were cheap, abundant, and utterly reliable. They did not fade, did not react, did not change. They were the foundation of shadow, the structure beneath more colorful layers. There was also a brown called bistre, made from the soot of burned wood, especially beechwood. Bistre was used primarily as an ink or wash in drawings and watercolors. It has a warm, transparent quality, and it was favored for its subtlety, its ability to create soft gradations of tone. Bistre was never as black as lamp black, never as opaque, but it had a gentle presence, a quiet warmth that suited certain kinds of work. Another brown, sepia, was made from the ink sacs of cuttlefish or squid. The ink was collected, dried, and processed into a pigment. Sepia is a rich, reddish brown, and it became especially popular in the 18th and 19th centuries for drawings and washes. The name sepia is now used to describe any brownish tone in photography or printing, but originally it referred specifically to this pigment from the sea. Let us pause and consider the grinding stones themselves, those mortars and pestles that turned minerals into paint. They were often made of hard stone, granite or basalt or marble, chosen for their durability and their smooth surfaces. Some grinding stones were used for only one pigment to avoid contamination. A stone used for ultramarine would never be used for red ochre, because even a trace of red would muddy the blue. The stones were cleaned carefully, sometimes with sand, sometimes with water, and they were treated with respect because they were tools, yes, but also partners in the work. In some workshops, the grinding was done by apprentices, the youngest members of the studio, who would spend hours each day preparing pigments. This was not seen as drudgery, but as training, a way to learn the materials, to understand their textures and behaviors, to develop a feel for the craft. The apprentice who ground pigments learned patience, learned attention, learned the importance of small, careful actions. And in time, that apprentice would become a painter, carrying forward the knowledge absorbed through the hands. The palette itself, the surface on which pigments were arranged and mixed, was another quiet tool. In ancient times, palettes were often made of wood, stone, or ceramic. Some were flat, some had shallow wells for holding small amounts of paint. The arrangement of colors on the palette was not random. It followed a logic, a geography of hue and value, with earth tones in one area, brights in another, whites and blacks at the edges. This arrangement helped the painter work quickly, intuitively, without having to search for the right color. Some palettes were portable, small enough to hold in one hand, with a thumb hole for gripping. Others were large, meant to rest on a table or bench. The palette was cleaned between sessions, or sometimes left to accumulate layers of dried paint, a record of past work, a kind of unintentional archive. In some old workshops, you can still find palettes with the dried paint of centuries ago, each layer a whisper of a painting that no longer exists, or that hangs now in a museum, far from the place it was made. Let us think now about the light in which these paintings were made and seen. In ancient times, there was no electric light, no bright, even illumination. Paintings were created by daylight, streaming through windows or open doors, or by the flicker of oil lamps and candles. This light was softer, warmer, more variable than modern light. It changed with the time of day, with the weather, with the seasons. And so the painter learned to see color in this shifting light, to mix pigments that would look right not in one fixed condition, but in many. The paintings, once finished, were also seen in this same soft, variable light. A fresco in a church was illuminated by candles during services, by sunlight filtering through high windows during the day. The colors would shift, glow, recede, come forward, depending on the light. This was part of the experience of the painting, part of its life. The modern museum, with its controlled lighting, its spotlights and temperature regulation, is a very different environment. And the paintings look different there, more stable, more fixed, but also perhaps less alive. Some pigments are more sensitive to light than others. Organic lakes, as we have noted, can fade when exposed to bright light over long periods. This is because light energy breaks the chemical bonds in the dye molecules, gradually destroying the color. Inorganic pigments, like ochres and ultramarine, are much more stable. Their color comes from the structure of the mineral itself, from the way electrons are arranged in the crystal lattice, and light does not easily change that structure. And so a painting made entirely of mineral pigments can last for thousands of years with little fading, while a painting that relies on organic colors may begin to pale within decades. This is one reason why ancient paintings often look different now than they did when they were new. The fugitive colors have faded, leaving behind the more stable ones. A robe that was once a rich purple, made by layering madder lake over azurite, may now appear mostly blue, the red having faded away. A landscape that had vibrant greens made with a yellow lake over blue may now look more blue-green, the yellow diminished. We see the ghosts of paintings, the bones of color, and we must imagine the flesh that once covered them. But there is something peaceful in this too. The paintings have aged, yes, but they have aged gracefully, slowly, in partnership with time. They have not disappeared. They have transformed, and in their transformation, they carry a record of the years, of visible history. We can study them, analyze them, use scientific techniques to understand what they once looked like, but we can also appreciate them as they are now, as survivors, as witnesses. Let us consider the role of light in the chemistry of pigments themselves. Some pigments, like ultramarine, are colored because they absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect others. Ultramarine absorbs red and yellow light and reflects blue. Our eyes receive that blue light, and we perceive the color. This interaction between light and matter is at the heart of all color. There is no color without light. In darkness, all pigments are the same, invisible, waiting. The particle size of a pigment also affects how it interacts with light. Very fine particles scatter light differently than coarse particles. This is why the same pigment, ground to different fineness, can look different. It is also why some pigments, when mixed with white, become lighter and brighter, while others become duller. The white particles scatter light in all directions, and this can either enhance the color or muddy it, depending on the refractive indices of the materials involved. Some pigments are transparent, meaning light can pass through them, and others are opaque, meaning light is blocked or reflected at the surface. Transparent pigments, like madder lake or ultramarine in a glaze, allow the underlayers to show through, creating depth and luminosity. Opaque pigments, like lead white or vermilion, cover what is beneath, creating solid, flat areas of color. The painter used both kinds, layering them, balancing transparency and opacity to build up the image. There is a pigment called Naples yellow, a lead antimonate, which was used from ancient times through the modern era. It is a soft, warm yellow, slightly peachy, and it was often used in flesh tones, in skies, and the highlights of drapery. Naples yellow is opaque, stable, and has a gentle, glowing quality. It was made by heating lead and antimony compounds together, a process that required knowledge and care. The resulting pigment was ground and used like any other, but it carried within it the heat of its making, a kind of frozen fire. In some ancient Egyptian paintings, a pigment called Egyptian green was used, though less commonly than Egyptian blue. Egyptian green is a copper-based frit, similar in structure to the blue, but with slightly different proportions of ingredients, resulting in a green rather than blue color. It is bright, opaque, and stable, and it was used for plants, for the skin of Osiris, for decorative elements. Like Egyptian blue, it is a synthetic pigment, a human invention, a quiet triumph of early chemistry. Let us think now about the way pigments were tested and evaluated. A painter needed to know if a pigment was pure, if it had been adulterated with cheaper materials. One way to test this was to mix a small amount with water or oil and observe how it behaved. Did it mix smoothly, or did it clump? Did the color remain even, or did it separate into different hues? Another test was to apply a thin layer to a surface and let it dry, then observe how it looked in different lights. Did it fade quickly? Did it darken? Did it react with the surface or with other pigments nearby? These tests were not scientific in the modern sense, but they were empirical, based on observation and experience. The painter developed an eye for quality, a sense of what was right, and this knowledge was valuable, a kind of currency in the workshop. A painter who could reliably identify and prepare good pigments was respected, sought after, trusted. There were also treatises and manuals that described pigments and their properties. One of the most famous is Cinnabar's Il Libro dell'Arte, written in the late 14th century. Cinnabar was a painter, and his book is a practical guide to the craft, covering everything from preparing panels to grinding pigments to applying gold leaf. He writes with affection about the materials, describing ultramarine as illustrious, beautiful, and most perfect beyond all other colors, and warning about the instability of verdigris. His book is both a technical manual and a love letter to painting, and it gives us a window into the medieval workshop, the rhythms and rituals of making art. Another important text is Theophilus's De Diversis Artibus, written in the 12th century, which covers not only painting but also metalwork and glassmaking. Theophilus describes how to make pigments, how to prepare surfaces, how to mix colors. His tone is instructive, patient, and he emphasizes the importance of practice, of learning by doing. These texts were copied and circulated, and they helped to spread knowledge across regions and generations. In the Islamic world, there were also treatises on pigments and painting, often connected to the art of manuscript illumination. These texts describe the preparation of colors from minerals, plants, and insects, and they include recipes for inks, binders, and varnishes. The knowledge was considered valuable, sometimes secret, and it was guarded carefully, shared only within certain circles. But over time, through trade and conquest and cultural exchange, this knowledge spread, and it enriched the palette of painters everywhere. Let us consider now the pigment called smalt, a blue made from ground cobalt glass. Smalt was used in Europe from the Renaissance onward, and it provided a cheaper alternative to ultramarine. Cobalt was heated with silica and potash to create a deep blue glass, which was then ground into a powder. Smalt is a beautiful blue, slightly grayish, and it was used in oil painting, in frescoes, and in decorative work. But smalt has a problem. Over time, the glass particles can lose their color, fading to a pale gray, or even becoming nearly transparent. This happens because the cobalt ions, which give the glass its blue color, can migrate or become chemically altered. Many paintings that once had rich blue skies or robes now appear faded or discolored because the smalt has degraded. This fading is a kind of quiet tragedy, a loss that happens slowly, invisibly, over decades and centuries. The painting changes, and we do not notice, because we did not see it when it was new. But scientific analysis can reveal the original intensity of the smalt, can show us what has been lost. And this knowledge, while bittersweet, helps us to understand the painting more fully, to see it not as a fixed object, but as a living thing, aging, changing, carrying its history in its very substance. There is also a green pigment called chrome green, though it came into use much later, in the 19th century. I mention it here only to note that the history of pigments did not end in antiquity. New pigments continued to be discovered and invented, each one expanding the painter's palette, offering new possibilities. But the ancient pigments, the ochres and carbons and minerals, remained in use because they were reliable, because they were beautiful, because they connected the painter to a tradition that stretched back to the beginning of human expression. The rhythm of preparing pigments was not only physical, but seasonal. Many workshops timed their pigment making to the weather, to the availability of water, to the dryness of the air. Certain tasks required warmth, others coolness. The grinding of pigments in winter produced finer particles because the stone stayed cool and the paste did not dry too quickly. In summer, binders could spoil, oils could thicken unpredictably, and so the work shifted toward tasks that required heat, melting resins, distilling oils, preparing varnishes. This seasonal awareness connected the painter to the same cycles that governed farming, navigation, and ritual. It was a quiet reminder that art was not separate from the world, but woven into it. The choice of grinding surface mattered deeply. Most pigments were ground on slabs of marble, porphyry, or granite, stones hard enough to withstand the pressure, smooth enough to avoid contamination. Porphyry, a dark volcanic stone flecked with crystals, was especially prized. Its surface was dense and fine, and it did not shed particles into the pigment. The muller, the grinding tool, was often made from the same stone, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand, weighted to do much of the work through gravity alone. The motion was circular, steady, almost hypnotic. In some workshops, apprentices would grind pigments for hours, and the sound, a soft, gritty whisper, became part of the ambient music of the studio. There was a pigment called dragon's blood, though it contained no dragons. It was a resin, deep red and translucent, harvested from certain trees in Southeast Asia and the Arabian Peninsula. The resin oozed from cuts in the bark and hardened into brittle, glassy tears. When dissolved in alcohol or oil, it produced a rich, glowing red, often used as a glaze over other colors to deepen shadows or warm flesh tones. It was not a true pigment in the sense of being opaque or stable, but it had a luminous quality that painters valued. The name itself carried a kind of poetry, a hint of the exotic, the distant. It reminded those who used it that color could travel across oceans, that a single brushstroke might contain the sap of a tree that grew in a forest they would never see. Another resin, called mastic, came from a small tree that grew only on the Greek island of Chios. The resin was harvested by making small cuts in the bark during the summer months. It dripped slowly, hardening into pale, translucent tears that were collected by hand. Mastic dissolved easily in turpentine and was used as a varnish, giving paintings a soft, even sheen. It also served as a binder in some oil paints, adding body and transparency. The scent of mastic was faint, slightly piney, and it lingered in the studio. Painters knew the smell well. It was the smell of finish, of completion, of a painting moving from wet to dry, from private to public. Lamp black, one of the oldest pigments, was made by burning oil in a shallow dish and collecting the soot that formed on a cool surface held above the flame. The soot was pure carbon, incredibly fine, and it produced a black of great depth and neutrality. It did not have the warmth of charcoal black or the coolness of bone black. It was simply perfectly black. The process of making it was simple, but it required patience. The flame had to be steady, The collection surface had to be cleaned frequently, and the soot had to be stored carefully to avoid contamination. In many workshops, lamp black was made in small batches, as needed, because it was so light that a little went a long way. Bone black, by contrast, was made by charring animal bones in a closed container, away from air. The bones turned black and brittle, and when ground, they produced a pigment that was not quite as dark as lamp black, but had a faint warmth, a hint of brown. It was often used for underpainting, for sketching in the initial composition, because it was inexpensive and mixed well with other colors. The process of making bone black was less pleasant than making lamp black. The smell of charring bone was strong and lingering, but the result was reliable. It was a pigment that asked little and gave much. There was a green pigment called terra verde, or green earth, that came from clay deposits rich in iron and magnesium. It was mined in regions of Italy, France, and Cyprus, and its color ranged from a soft, mossy green to a deeper, more olive tone. Terra verde was not a bright green. It was muted, subtle, almost gray in some lights, but it had a unique quality. It was semi-transparent, and when used in thin layers, it allowed the white ground beneath to glow through, giving a luminous quality to shadows and skin tones. In the Renaissance, it was commonly used for underpainting flesh, especially in egg tempera. The green underpainting would be covered with layers of warmer, more opaque colors, but the green remained visible in the shadows, giving the skin a lifelike coolness, a sense of blood beneath the surface. The use of terra verde in this way was based on careful observation. Human skin, especially in shadow, often has a faint greenish or grayish cast, a result of the way light penetrates and scatters in the layers of the skin. By starting with a green underpainting, artists could build up layers that mimicked this optical complexity. It was a technique that required patience and trust, because the initial stages of the painting looked strange. Faces appeared sickly, corpse-like, but as the layers accumulated, the effect became convincing, even magical. The green disappeared from conscious perception, but it remained as a foundation, a quiet support for the warmth above. Lead tin yellow was a bright, opaque yellow used widely in European painting from the medieval period through the 17th century. It was made by heating lead and tin oxides together at high temperatures, a process that required skill and care. The resulting pigment was stable, light-fast, and had excellent covering power. It could be mixed with blues to create vivid greens, or used alone for highlights, for gold embroidery, for the bright petals of flowers. Then, mysteriously, it disappeared. By the 18th century, it was no longer being made. The recipe was lost, or perhaps simply abandoned in favor of other yellows. For centuries, art historians did not even know that lead tin yellow had existed as a distinct pigment. It was only in the 20th century, through scientific analysis of old paintings, that it was rediscovered and identified. Now it is recognized as one of the key colors of Renaissance and Baroque painting, a pigment that shaped the visual language of an entire era, then quietly vanished. The rediscovery of lead tin yellow is a reminder that our knowledge of the past is always incomplete, always being revised. There are likely other pigments, other techniques that have been forgotten, that exist now only as anonymous traces in old paintings. Each scientific study, each careful analysis, brings a little more into the light. It is detective work, but it is also a form of conversation across time, a way of listening to what the paintings themselves have to say about how they were made. Indian yellow was a pigment of particularly strange origin. It was a bright, transparent yellow with a slight greenish cast, used primarily in miniature painting and watercolor. For a long time, its source was a mystery. It came from India, that much was known, but the exact method of production was unclear. Eventually, It was discovered that Indian yellow was made from the urine of cows that had been fed only mango leaves. The urine was collected, heated, and the yellow sediment that formed was dried into lumps or balls. The practice was eventually banned in the early 20th century on grounds of animal cruelty, as the restricted diet was harmful to the cows. The pigment is no longer made, though synthetic substitutes exist. The story of Indian yellow is unsettling, a reminder that beauty has sometimes come at a cost, that the history of color is not always comfortable. Yet even in this discomfort, there is something to learn. The story prompts reflection on the relationship between art and ethics, between desire and consequence. It asks us to consider what we are willing to do, or to allow, in the pursuit of beauty. These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers, but they are worth holding gently in mind as we move through the history of pigments. Smalt, the blue glass powder we encountered earlier, had a particular vulnerability. Over time, especially in oil paintings, it could lose its color entirely, fading to a dull gray or becoming nearly invisible. This happened because the potassium in the glass was slowly leached out by the oil medium, leaving behind a colorless silicate skeleton. Paintings that once had brilliant blue skies or rich blue robes now appear faded, their blues reduced to ghosts. In some cases, scientific analysis can reveal where the smalt once was, even though the color is gone. Infrared imaging and other techniques can detect the particles, allowing us to imagine what the painting once looked like. It is a poignant form of loss, a color that existed, that was chosen and applied with care, and that has now retreated beyond the reach of the eye. This fading of smalt is not the fault of the painters. They used the best materials available to them, and smalt was, for a time, the best affordable blue. They could not have known that the color would not last. It is a reminder that all materials have limits, that permanence is always relative. Even the most stable pigments will eventually change, given enough time. The paintings we see in museums are not identical to the paintings as they were first made. They are older versions of themselves, transformed by time, by light, by the chemistry of their own materials. To see them is to see both what was intended and what has happened since. A double image, a palimpsest. There was a pigment called malachite, a yellow form of lead oxide, used occasionally in European painting. It was made by heating lead white to a moderate temperature, causing it to turn yellow. If heated further, it would turn red-orange, becoming a pigment called minium or red lead. Malachite was not as commonly used as lead tin yellow, but it had its place, particularly in underpainting and in mixtures. Like all lead pigments, it was toxic, and it could darken over time if exposed to sulfur compounds. But in the right conditions, protected by layers of varnish or glaze, it remained stable and bright. The ability to transform one pigment into another through heat was a kind of alchemy, a demonstration that color was not fixed, but mutable, responsive to energy and intention. Red lead, or minium, was used not only in painting, but also as a protective coating for metal, particularly iron. It prevented rust, and so it was applied to gates, railings, and the hulls of ships. The color was a bright red-orange, bold and visible, and it became associated with warning, with protection, with boundaries. In manuscripts, red lead was used for rubrics, headings and important passages, and the word rubric itself comes from the Latin for red. The pigment was inexpensive and easy to make, and it served both practical and symbolic functions. It marked what was important, what needed attention, what should not be crossed. In the Islamic world, a particularly beautiful blue was made from grinding lapis lazuli, just as in Europe, but the technique of preparing it was sometimes different. Instead of the elaborate washing process used to make ultramarine, some painters used the lapis directly, grinding it finely and mixing it with a binder. The result was a blue that was slightly less pure, slightly more violet, but still luminous. The choice of technique depended on the intended use, on the availability of time and resources, and on the aesthetic preferences of the painter or patron. There was no single correct way to use lapis lazuli. There were many ways, each with its own character, its own voice. In Chinese painting, a blue pigment called Azurite was used extensively, just as in Europe, but it was often applied in a way that emphasized texture. The pigment was ground to different levels of fineness, and the coarser particles were sometimes used to create a sparkling, granular effect, especially in depictions of water, sky, and mountains. The texture added a sense of movement, of light catching on a surface, of the material presence of the paint itself. This was not a flaw or a limitation, but a deliberate choice, a way of making the pigment an active participant in the image, rather than a passive vehicle for color. Similarly, malachite was used in Chinese painting, ground to various particle sizes. The coarser the grind, the more vibrant and sparkling the green, but also the more difficult to control. Fine malachite produced a smoother, more subdued green. Painters learned to match the grind to the subject, coarse for lively foliage or decorative elements, fine for delicate details or distant landscapes. This sensitivity to the material, this willingness to let the pigment's own qualities shape the image, was a form of collaboration between the artist and the substance, a conversation conducted through grinding, mixing, and brushing. In Japan, a pigment called gofun was made from crushed oyster shells. The shells were cleaned, baked, and ground into a fine white powder, which was then mixed with animal glue to create a paint. Gofun was used as a white pigment and as a ground for paintings on silk and paper. It had a soft, warm tone, not as stark as lead white, and it absorbed and reflected light in a gentle way. The process of making gofun was labor-intensive, but the material was abundant and non-toxic, and it produced a surface that was sympathetic to delicate brushwork. The use of shells, a material from the sea, connected the painter to the natural world, to cycles of life and death, to the patient accumulation of calcium by living creatures. Another Japanese pigment, called sumi, was an ink made from soot, usually pine soot, mixed with glue and formed into solid sticks. To use it, the painter would grind the stick on a stone with a little water, producing a liquid ink of variable intensity. The process of grinding the ink was meditative, a moment of preparation and focus before the brush touched the paper. The quality of the sumi depended on the quality of the soot, the purity of the glue, and the skill of the maker. The best sumi was smooth, deep, and responsive, capable of producing a wide range of tones from the palest gray to the richest black. It was not merely a tool, but a partner in the act of painting, a substance with its own character and mood. In India, painters used a range of mineral and organic pigments, many of them similar to those used elsewhere, but prepared and applied according to local traditions. One distinctive practice was the use of gold and silver in manuscript illumination and miniature painting. The metals were ground into fine powders or applied as leaf, and they were often burnished to a high shine. The gold did not merely represent light. It was light, catching and reflecting the illumination of the room, changing as the viewer moved. This active, shifting quality made the paintings feel alive, responsive, engaged with the viewer's presence. The preparation of gold for painting required great care. Gold leaf, which is gold hammered into sheets so thin that light can pass through them, was sometimes cut into tiny pieces and ground with a binding medium. Alternatively, gold powder could be made by grinding gold with salt or another abrasive, then washing away the abrasive to leave pure gold particles. These particles were mixed with gum or glue and applied with a brush. The result was a matte gold, less reflective than leaf, but easier to use for fine details. Both techniques required patience and a steady hand, and both connected the painter to a long tradition of using precious materials to honor sacred subjects. Silver was used in a similar way, though it had a significant drawback: it tarnished. Over time, silver pigments and silver leaf would darken, turning gray or even black as the silver reacted with sulfur compounds in the air. Many medieval and Renaissance manuscripts that once had bright silver details now appear to have black or dark gray areas instead. The tarnishing is irreversible, a permanent transformation. It is a reminder that even metals, which seem so stable, are subject to change. The paintings carry this history within them, the evidence of time's passage written in the darkening of the silver. In Tibetan Thangka painting, a rich tradition of pigment use developed, drawing on materials from across Asia. Mineral pigments like azurite, malachite, cinnabar, and orpiment were ground and mixed with animal glue. Gold was used extensively, both as a pigment and as leaf, often applied to highlight the most sacred elements of the composition. The preparation of pigments was considered a spiritual practice, a form of devotion. Painters would often recite mantras while grinding, infusing the materials with intention and prayer. The act of making color was not separate from the act of making meaning. It was all one continuous practice, a way of bringing the sacred into visible form. The binding medium in Thangka painting was typically animal glue, made by boiling down hides or bones. The glue was mixed with the pigment to create a paint that dried quickly and adhered well to the cotton or silk support. The paintings were often varnished with a thin layer of glue or a mixture of glue and water to protect the surface and enhance the colors. This varnish gave the paintings a slight sheen, a sense of depth, and it helped to unify the colors, making them appear more luminous. The choice of binder and varnish was as important as the choice of pigment, and it required knowledge passed down through generations of painters. In Persian miniature painting, another rich tradition, pigments were applied in thin, precise layers, building up color gradually. The technique allowed for great control and refinement, and it produced paintings of extraordinary delicacy and detail. The pigments used were similar to those in European and Asian painting: ultramarine, azurite, malachite, cinnabar, lead white, lamp black, but the aesthetic was distinct. Persian miniatures often featured flat areas of intense color, with little modeling or shadow, and the compositions were organized in a way that emphasized pattern and rhythm over perspective. The pigments were servants to this vision, chosen and applied to create a world that was both decorative and deeply expressive. One of the challenges in Persian miniature painting was achieving smooth, even areas of color, especially with opaque pigments like lead white or cinnabar. This required careful preparation of the paint, ensuring that the pigment was finely ground and well mixed with the binder. It also required skillful brushwork, applying multiple thin layers rather than one thick one, and allowing each layer to dry before applying the next. The process was slow, but it produced surfaces of remarkable beauty, where the color seemed to float on the page, weightless and pure. In Ethiopian icon painting, a tradition that stretches back many centuries, pigments were applied to wooden panels prepared with a ground of gesso, much like in European panel painting. The colors were often bold and symbolic: red for martyrdom, blue for heaven, gold for divinity. The pigments were locally sourced when possible, but some, like ultramarine, were imported at great expense. The act of painting an icon was a sacred task, undertaken with prayer and fasting, and the materials themselves were treated with reverence. The pigments were not merely substances, but participants in a holy work, channels through which the divine could be made visible. In Aboriginal Australian art, pigments were made from ochres, charcoal, and white clays, much like the earliest pigments used by humans anywhere. These materials were ground and mixed with water, saliva, or plant juices, and applied to rock surfaces, bark, sand, and bodies. The colors were limited: reds, yellows, whites, blacks, but within this limited palette, a vast range of expression was possible. The pigments were gathered from specific sites, often places of spiritual significance, and the act of gathering and preparing them was woven into the larger web of story, ceremony, and connection to country. The paintings were not separate from the land. They were extensions of it, made from its very substance. In many indigenous cultures around the world, the preparation and use of pigments was accompanied by ritual, by song, by specific protocols about who could gather the materials and how they should be used. This was not superstition, but a recognition that materials carry meaning, that they are part of a larger system of relationships. To use a pigment was to enter into that system, to acknowledge one's place within it, to honor the sources from which the color came. This understanding has largely been lost in industrialized societies, where pigments are purchased in tubes and bottles, anonymous and disconnected from their origins. But it remains a valuable perspective, a reminder that materials have histories, that they come from somewhere, that they are gifts. The study of ancient pigments is not only about chemistry and art history. It is also about human ingenuity, about the drive to make meaning, to communicate, to leave a mark. Every pigment represents a problem solved, a challenge met. How do you make a color that will last? How do you bind it so it adheres? How do you apply it so it looks the way you intend? These are practical questions, but they are also philosophical ones because they ask what it means to make something permanent, to create beauty, to transform raw material into meaning. And there is something deeply comforting in knowing that these questions have been asked for tens of thousands of years, that people in every culture and every era have ground stones, burned wood, mixed binders, and applied color to surfaces. It is a continuity that spans the entire history of our species, a thread that connects us to our most distant ancestors. When we look at an ancient painting, we are looking at the traces of this effort, this care, this desire to make the world more beautiful, more meaningful, more comprehensible. The pigments themselves, in their quiet stability, in their patient endurance, offer a kind of reassurance. They do not hurry. They do not demand. They simply are holding their color, holding their place, waiting to be seen. And in this waiting, in this stillness, there's a lesson. We too can be still. We, too, can hold our place, can trust that what we are is enough, that we do not need to rush or strive or prove. We can simply be, like the ochre in the cave, like the ultramarine in the sky, like the lamp black in the shadow. The grinding of pigments, the mixing, the applying, all of these are acts of patience. They cannot be hurried. The stone must be worked slowly. The binder must be measured carefully. The layers must be allowed to dry. There is a rhythm to it, a pace that is set not by the clock, but by the materials themselves. This rhythm is calming. It pulls us out of the frantic pace of modern life and into a slower, more deliberate way of being. It teaches us that good work takes time, that quality cannot be rushed, that there is value in the process itself, not only in the finished product. And so, as we think about these pigments, as we imagine the hands that ground them, the eyes that chose them, the brushes that applied them, we can let ourselves slow down. We can let the images form gently in our minds. The cool blue of azurite, the warm red of ochre, the deep black of charcoal. We can picture the workshops, the studios, the caves, the quiet concentration of the painters. We can feel the weight of the muller in the hand, the smooth resistance of the stone, the gradual transformation of rough mineral into fine powder. There is no urgency here. There is no crisis, no conflict, no danger. There is only the steady, patient work of making color and the quiet beauty that results. This is a safe place to rest our attention, a gentle place to let our thoughts settle. The pigments do not ask anything of us. They simply offer themselves, their stories, their colors, their presence. And we can receive them softly, gratefully, letting them fill the space where worry or restlessness might otherwise dwell. The quietest truth about ancient pigments is that they were never meant to shout. They were ground slowly, applied carefully, and left to do their work across centuries without complaint. The painters who used them understood that color was not decoration but substance, not ornament but truth made visible. Each pigment carried its own character, its own temperament, and the artist learned to work with that character rather than against it. This partnership between human intention and material nature created something more durable than either could achieve alone. It is a reassuring thought that patience and respect for materials can yield beauty that outlasts empires. In the medieval workshops of Europe, apprentices learned pigment preparation before they ever touched a brush to panel. They spent months, sometimes years, grinding colors and preparing grounds. This was not tedious labor, but essential education. By grinding lapis lazuli into ultramarine, they learned the resistance and yield of stone. By tempering red ochre with egg yolk, they discovered how binder and pigment must marry to create paint. By watching how vermilion behaved differently in summer and winter, they absorbed the rhythms of materials responding to their environment. This slow apprenticeship built not just skill, but intimacy with color, a relationship that would guide their hand for the rest of their working lives. The Islamic world contributed profoundly to the science and art of pigments, preserving ancient knowledge and expanding it through experiment and observation. Persian and Arabic manuscripts on alchemy and art making describe dozens of pigments, their sources, their preparation, and their combinations. These texts reveal a culture deeply engaged with the chemistry of color, viewing it as part of a larger understanding of transformation and beauty. The brilliant blues and golds of Persian miniatures, the intricate tile work of mosques, the luminous calligraphy of Quranic manuscripts, all drew on this accumulated wisdom. Pigments were prepared with care, applied with precision, and understood as part of the sacred craft that honored both material and meaning. One pigment that appears across many cultures is red lead, also known as minium. It is made by heating white lead in air, allowing it to oxidize into a vivid orange-red powder. The Romans used it extensively. The Chinese employed it in lacquer work and painting, and medieval European illuminators loved it for its brightness and opacity. Red lead covers well, dries reliably, and creates a warm, assertive color that draws the eye. Over time, however, it can darken or react with sulfur compounds in the air, shifting toward brown or black. Many medieval manuscripts show this transformation, their once brilliant red initials now shadowed and somber. Yet even in this change, there is no violence, only the quiet chemistry of centuries. Another warm pigment, less stable but deeply loved, was realgar's close relative, perialgar. Realgar itself, as we have explored, is arsenic sulfide, a fiery orange mineral. When exposed to light over long periods, realgar can transform into perialgar, a yellow form of the same compound. This transformation is gradual and light-dependent, a kind of slow fading that painters could not predict or prevent. In some ancient paintings, what was once a bold orange is softened in a pale yellow or even colorless powder. The change is irreversible, a one-way journey written into the structure of the mineral itself. Yet there is something peaceful in knowing that even this loss follows natural law, that the painting continues to live and respond to its environment. The preparation of grounds, the surface layers onto which pigments are applied, was as important as the pigments themselves. In European panel painting, the ground was typically gesso, a mixture of chalk or gypsum and animal glue. This ground was applied in many thin layers, each allowed to dry and then smoothed. The result was a luminous, absorbent surface that held paint beautifully and reflected light back through translucent colors. In Asian painting, grounds varied widely: sized silk, sized paper, or prepared plaster for murals. Each ground influenced how pigments appeared and behaved. A color that glowed on gesso might look flat on unsized paper. Understanding grounds was understanding the foundation of all color. Egg tempera, the dominant medium of European panel painting before the spread of oil, has a particular relationship with pigments. The egg yolk acts as both binder and emulsifier, holding pigment particles in suspension and allowing them to adhere to the ground. Tempera dries quickly, almost immediately, which means the painter must work in small strokes, building up color through layering rather than blending wet paint. This technique suits certain pigments beautifully: earth colors, lead white, vermilion, ultramarine, all of which retain their clarity and brightness in tempera. The medium does not yellow significantly with age, so colors remain true. Tempera paintings from the 14th and 15th centuries often look remarkably fresh, their colors as clear as the day they were painted. Fresco, another ancient technique, imposes its own demands on pigment choice. In true fresco, pigments are applied to wet lime plaster. As the plaster dries, it undergoes carbonation. The lime reacts with carbon dioxide in the air to form calcium carbonate, effectively encasing the pigment in stone. Only pigments that are alkali stable can survive this process. Earth colors work beautifully in fresco, so do certain blacks and some mineral blues and greens. But pigments that react with lime, like azurite or verdigris, cannot be used in true fresco. They must be applied later, a secco, onto the dry surface. This means that fresco painters had a more limited palette than panel painters, but within those limits, they achieved extraordinary subtlety and durability. The frescoes of Giotto, Masaccio, and Michelangelo testify to the power of restraint and deep knowledge of materials. One of the commonest pigments in the fresco palette is terra verde, or green earth. It is a naturally occurring clay containing iron and magnesium silicate, giving it a soft, muted green color. Terra verde is completely stable in fresco, unaffected by lime, light, or time. It was often used for underpainting flesh tones, a technique called verdaccio. The green underlayer would show through subsequent layers of pink and ochre, creating a subtle coolness in the shadows and giving faces a lifelike depth. Even when the upper layers have worn away, the green underdrawing remains, a quiet ghost of the painter's method. Terra verde asks nothing, changes nothing, and endures. In Chinese painting, the concept of color was deeply tied to philosophy and cosmology. The 5 traditional colors, black, red, yellow, white, and blue-green, corresponded to the 5 elements, the 5 directions, and the 5 phases of transformation. Pigments were chosen not only for their visual qualities, but for their symbolic resonance. Cinnabar red was associated with the south, with fire, with vitality. Ink black was linked to the north, to water, to depth and mystery. This symbolic dimension did not replace careful observation of how pigments behaved, but it enriched the painter's relationship with materials. Color was never arbitrary. It was part of a larger pattern, a way of situating the painting within the order of the world. Japanese painters developed a particular sensitivity to the texture and surface quality of pigments. In traditional Nihonga painting, pigments are often left slightly granular, so that light catches on the surface and creates a subtle sparkle or texture. This is especially true of mineral pigments like azurite and malachite, which are ground to specific particle sizes depending on the desired effect. Coarser particles create a more textured, vibrant surface. Finer particles yield a smoother, more subdued color. The painter chooses the grind as carefully as the hue. This attention to the physical presence of pigment, its materiality, is a form of respect. The pigment is not just a means to an end, but a presence in its own right. The ancient Egyptians, as we have touched upon, were master chemists of color. They not only invented Egyptian blue, but also developed sophisticated techniques for applying pigments. In tomb paintings, pigments were typically applied to a thin layer of mud plaster or gesso. The colors were bound with water and a little gum or glue, a simple medium that allowed the pigments to retain their intensity. Egyptian painters worked quickly, with confidence born of long training. Lines were sure, colors were flat and bold, and the overall effect was one of clarity and permanence. These paintings were meant to endure in the dark, to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Their durability is not accidental, but intentional, a product of material knowledge and spiritual purpose. One of the most enduring and gentle pigments is calcium carbonate, in the form of chalk or limestone. It is the same compound that forms seashells, coral, and the white cliffs of Dover. Ground finely, it becomes whiting, a soft white pigment used in grounds, in paints, and as a filler. It is chemically stable, non-toxic, abundant, and inexpensive. It does not dazzle like lead white, but it serves quietly and well. In many paintings, chalk forms the foundation, the invisible support that allows other colors to shine. It is a reminder that the most essential materials are often the simplest, the ones that ask least and give most. Soot, in its many forms, provided black pigments that were both practical and profound. Lamp black, made from burning oil, is a soft, deep black with a slight warmth. Vine black, made from charred grapevines, is cooler and slightly granular. Bone black, as we have explored, contains not just carbon, but calcium phosphate, giving it body and a unique tone. Each black has its own character, and painters learn to choose among them depending on the context. A cool black for shadows in a sky, a warm black for the depths of drapery, a dense black for calligraphy. These distinctions may seem subtle, but they're the substance of mastery, the quiet choices that accumulate into beauty. The concept of color permanence was understood differently in different times and places. In some traditions, the fading or changing of colors was accepted as part of the life of the painting. In others, permanence was a paramount concern, and great effort went into selecting and combining pigments that would endure. Japanese scroll paintings, for instance, were often stored in darkness and brought out only occasionally, a practice that preserved their colors. European panel paintings were sometimes protected behind curtains or shutters. These practices reflect an awareness that light, air, and time all act upon pigments, and that care in handling and display is part of the painter's responsibility. One of the most luminous and delicate pigments is gofun, the traditional Japanese white made from oyster or clam shells. The shells are cleaned, baked, and ground into an extremely fine powder. The result is a soft, slightly warm white with a gentle opacity. Gofun is mixed with animal glue and applied in layers, each layer adding to the luminosity. It does not have the brilliance of lead white, but it has a quiet glow, a presence that is felt rather than seen. Gofun is still used today in traditional Japanese painting, a direct link to centuries of practice. It is a pigment that asks for patience and rewards it with beauty. Orpiment and realgar, the arsenic sulfides, were used together in many traditions to create a range of warm colors from yellow through orange to red. Despite their toxicity, they were valued for their intensity and their ability to create effects that no other pigments could match. In Persian miniatures, orpiment was often used for golden robes and sunlit skies. In Chinese painting, realgar provided a fiery accent in landscapes and figures. The painters who used these pigments were aware of their dangers and took precautions, working in ventilated spaces, washing hands carefully, avoiding ingestion. The relationship was one of respect and caution, not fear. The pigments were powerful, and power requires care. One of the quiet miracles of pigment chemistry is that so many pigments are simply earth. Ochres, siennas, umbers. These are clays and soils, dug from the ground, washed, dried, and ground. They require no complex synthesis, no rare ingredients, no dangerous processes. Yet they provide a range of colors that can describe almost anything: skin, wood, stone, earth, shadow, light. They are the backbone of the painter's palette, the colors that anchor all others. And they are completely stable, unaffected by light, air, or time. A painting done entirely in earth colors will look essentially the same in 1,000 years. There is deep reassurance in this, a sense that simplicity and durability are inseparable. The grinding of pigments was often a meditative practice, a time for reflection and preparation. The rhythmic motion of the muller on the slab, the gradual transformation of coarse particles into smooth paste, the slow emergence of the pigment's true color, all of this created a space for quiet focus. In monastic workshops, grinding pigments was sometimes accompanied by prayer or chant. In secular workshops, it was a time for teaching, for passing on knowledge from master to apprentice. The act of grinding was not separate from the act of painting, but continuous with it, part of the same process of bringing color into the world. Pigments were also traded over vast distances, creating networks of exchange that connected continents. Lapis lazuli traveled from Afghanistan to Egypt, to Rome, to medieval Europe. Cinnabar moved along the Silk Road from China to Persia and beyond. Indigo crossed oceans from India to Europe and the Americas. These trade routes were not just economic but cultural, carrying with them techniques, ideas, and aesthetic values. A pigment arriving in a new place brought with it the possibility of new colors, new methods, new ways of seeing. The history of pigments is inseparable from the history of human connection and exchange. In some cultures, the preparation and use of pigments was a sacred act, performed with ritual care. Tibetan Thangka painters, for instance, often begin their work with prayers and offerings, acknowledging the spiritual dimension of their craft. The pigments themselves, especially precious ones like gold and lapis, are treated with reverence. The act of painting becomes a form of meditation, a way of focusing the mind and honoring the divine. This sacred approach does not diminish the technical skill required, but deepens it, infusing every gesture with intention and meaning. The palette of ancient Rome was rich and varied, drawing on pigments from across the empire. Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius, offer a vivid record of Roman color. The walls of houses and villas were painted with bold reds, deep yellows, rich blacks, and vibrant blues. These colors have survived remarkably well, protected by the volcanic ash that buried them. The reds are often cinnabar or red ochre. The yellows are ochre or orpiment. The blacks are carbon-based, and the blues are Egyptian blue. The palette is warm, earthy, and confident, reflecting a culture that valued color as part of daily life, not reserved for temples or tombs, but present in homes and public spaces. One of the most interesting aspects of ancient pigments is their granularity, the way particle size affects color. A pigment ground coarsely will scatter light differently than the same pigment ground finely. Coarse particles create a more saturated, vibrant color with visible texture. Fine particles yield a smoother, more subtle color. Painters learned to control this variable, grinding pigments to the desired fineness for each application. In Japanese painting, as mentioned, this control is especially refined, with different grinds of the same mineral used in different parts of a single painting. This sensitivity to the physical properties of pigments is a form of knowledge that goes beyond chemistry into the realm of craft and intuition. The yellows derived from lead tin yellow, massicot, litharge, were workhorses of the painter's palette for centuries. They were bright, opaque, and stable in many mediums. Lead tin yellow, in particular, was prized for its warm, sunny hue and its excellent covering power. It was used in everything from manuscript illumination to panel painting to ceramics. The pigment fell out of use in the 18th century, replaced by other yellows, and its method of manufacture was forgotten. Modern analysis has revealed its composition, but the exact recipes and techniques remain partly mysterious. This loss and rediscovery is a reminder that knowledge of materials is fragile, easily lost when traditions are interrupted. Verdigris, the green corrosion of copper, is one of the most unstable pigments in the traditional palette. It is beautiful when fresh, a bright, clear blue-green, but it can darken over time, especially in oil. It can also react with other pigments and with the medium itself, causing cracking or discoloration. Despite these problems, verdigris was widely used because it was one of the few bright greens available. Painters learned to use it carefully, isolating it from other colors, applying it in thin layers, and sometimes glazing it over more stable underlayers. The use of verdigris required skill and experience, a willingness to work with a difficult material because of the beauty it offered. In Indian miniature painting, the palette was both rich and disciplined. Gold and silver were used extensively, not just for highlights, but as full backgrounds, creating a luminous space for figures and narratives. Lapis ultramarine provided deep blues, often for the skin of deities like Krishna. Vermilion and red lead offered vibrant reds. Orpiment and various organic yellows created golds and sunny accents. The pigments were ground finely and applied in smooth, even layers, often burnished to a high sheen. The result is a jewel-like surface, glowing with color and light. These paintings were made to be held in the hand, viewed closely, and admired for their detail and craftsmanship. The concept of a palette itself, the range of colors a painter uses, was often determined by what was locally available or affordable. A painter in a remote monastery might have access only to earth colors, charcoal, and a few plant-based dyes. A painter in a wealthy court might have ultramarine, gold, vermilion, and rare organic reds. Yet great art was made with both limited and expansive palettes. The limitation itself could be a source of creativity, forcing the painter to explore the full range of a few colors rather than reaching for many. Some of the most moving paintings are those made with the simplest means, where restraint and deep knowledge combine to create beauty. The drying time of pigments, or rather of the binder mixed with pigments, profoundly affects the painting process. Tempera dries almost instantly, requiring the painter to work in small, deliberate strokes. Oil dries slowly, allowing for blending, glazing, and reworking. Fresco must be completed while the plaster is wet, which might be only a few hours. Each medium imposes its own rhythm, and the painter must learn to move with that rhythm rather than against it. This is another form of partnership, another way in which materials guide and teach. The painter is not the sole author of the work, but a collaborator with substances that have their own nature and timing. One of the most serene aspects of pigment history is the continuity of certain materials across millennia. Ochre used in a Paleolithic cave painting is chemically identical to ochre used in a Renaissance fresco. Charcoal made by a prehistoric fire tender is the same as charcoal made by a 20th century artist. These materials are not innovations, but discoveries, recognitions of what the earth offers. They connect us across unimaginable spans of time, a thread of color running through the entire human story. There is comfort in this continuity, a sense that some things remain constant even as everything else changes. The interaction between pigments and light is a central concern of painting. Some pigments absorb certain wavelengths and reflect others, creating the colors we see. Some pigments are transparent, allowing light to pass through and reflect off under layers. Some are opaque, blocking light entirely. Painters learned to layer transparent and opaque pigments to create effects of depth and luminosity. A glaze of transparent red over opaque white creates a glow that neither pigment alone could achieve. A scumble of opaque light color over a dark underlayer creates a misty, atmospheric effect. These techniques are based on understanding how light and pigment interact, a knowledge built through experiment and observation over generations. The toxicity of certain pigments, lead white, vermilion, orpiment, emerald green, was a real concern, but it did not prevent their use. Painters developed practices to minimize risk, working in ventilated spaces, avoiding hand-to-mouth contact, washing thoroughly. Some pigments were known to be dangerous and were handled with extra care. Others, like lead white, were so useful and so universally employed that their risks were accepted as part of the trade. It is worth noting that many painters lived long, productive lives despite working with toxic materials. The key was knowledge and care, not avoidance. This is a model we can still learn from: respect for materials, awareness of risk, and thoughtful practice. The preparation of organic pigments, those derived from plants and animals, required different skills than mineral pigments. Plant materials had to be harvested at the right time, processed quickly to preserve color, and often combined with mordants to make them permanent. Insect-based pigments like cochineal required careful extraction and purification. These processes were often closely guarded secrets, passed down within families or guilds. The knowledge was practical and empirical, learned through doing rather than reading. It was a living tradition, adapted to local conditions and materials. When these traditions were disrupted by colonization, industrialization, or social change, much of this knowledge was lost. What remains is fragmentary, preserved in old recipes and the analysis of surviving artworks. The color blue has a special place in the history of pigments because good blues were so rare and difficult to obtain. Egyptian blue, azurite, and ultramarine were the primary options for much of history. Each had its advantages and limitations. Egyptian blue was stable, but required manufacturer knowledge. Azurite was more widely available, but could turn green. Ultramarine was perfect, but prohibitively expensive. The search for better blues drove much of the experimentation in pigment chemistry. The eventual synthesis of Prussian blue in the 18th century and cobalt blue in the 19th expanded the palette dramatically, but those are later stories. For ancient and medieval painters, blue was precious, used sparingly and with great intention. One of the gentlest truths about pigments is that they are patient. They wait in the earth for millennia before being discovered. They wait in jars and pots for the painter to use them. They wait on the wall or panel, holding their color through centuries. They do not demand attention, do not insist on being seen. They simply are quietly present, doing the work they were made for. This patience is a quality we might aspire to, a steadiness that does not waver with time or circumstance. The pigments teach us, if we are willing to learn, that endurance is not about resistance, but about being true to one's nature. The practice of painting with traditional pigments continues today, though it is now a choice rather than a necessity. Synthetic pigments offer greater consistency, safety, and range of color. Yet some painters still seek out natural pigments, grind their own colors, and work with traditional mediums. They do this not out of nostalgia, but out of a desire for a particular quality, a particular relationship with materials. There is something in the texture, the behavior, the presence of natural pigments that cannot be fully replicated. This is not to say that synthetic pigments are inferior, only that they are different. Both have their place, and the choice between them is a personal one, based on what the painter values and seeks. The grinding slab and muller, tools unchanged for thousands of years, are still used by painters who prepare their own pigments. The slab is typically glass or marble, smooth and non-porous. The muller is a heavy, flat-bottomed tool, also glass or stone, that fits comfortably in the hand. Pigment and a little medium are placed on the slab, and the muller is moved in circular or figure-8 patterns, crushing and dispersing the particles. The process is slow, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It requires no electricity, no complex equipment, just hand and stone and pigment. This simplicity is part of its appeal. It connects the painter directly to the material, without intermediaries or machines. In the end, the story of pigments is a story about transformation. Earth becomes color, stone becomes light, plants and insects become hues that capture sunlight, shadow, flesh, and sky. These transformations are achieved through human effort, digging, grinding, heating, mixing, but they are also collaborations with the materials themselves, which offer their properties and possibilities. The painter does not create color from nothing, but reveals and arranges what is already present in the world. This is a humble and beautiful understanding of art making, one that places the artist within nature rather than above it. As we come to the end of this long, quiet journey through the world of ancient pigments, let yourself rest in the knowledge that color is a gift, patiently prepared and generously given. The ochres and charcoals, the lapis and vermilion, the plant dyes and insect reds, all of these were gathered, ground, and applied by human hands working in partnership with the earth. The paintings they created have endured, carrying forward not just images, but the presence of the people who made them and the materials they loved. This continuity, this conversation across time, is one of the most reassuring aspects of human culture. We are not alone. We are part of a long tradition of making, seeing, and caring. If you are still awake, know that there are more stories waiting, more quiet explorations of the natural world and the human engagement with it. But if sleep is calling, let it come. Let the colors we have explored, warm ochres, cool blues, deep blacks, luminous whites, drift through your thoughts like a gentle palette, each one a note in a long, slow song. There is no urgency, no need to remember every detail. The knowledge is there, quietly present, like pigment waiting in a jar. Rest now, knowing that the world is full of beautiful, patient things. The stones that become color, the plants that yield dye, the hands that grind and mix and paint. All of these continue their work in studios and workshops, in museums and caves, in the earth itself. You are safe in this continuity, held by the same forces that have shaped color and light for as long as humans have made marks on surfaces. Let that thought be a comfort as you close your eyes. Good night.